Here. We can start. Oh my goodness. Hi everybody. If anybody wants to sit right up front, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seats right up front. And a bench. And one here. And it's going to be great. So yes, if anybody wants to. It's also fine if you don't want to. Oh, I love that ring. Well, first of all, welcome to the Writers' House. And I have several shows of hands I would like to request. How many of you is it welcome back to the Writers' House? How many of you have been here before? I have been here before. People have been here before. All right. First of all, let's give a big welcome back to the Writers' House to these 4 people. My name's Jamie-Lee Josselyn. I work here. So many of you alums, you did this thing where you graduated and you left Penn and now you've come back for maybe your reunion or maybe just for Alumni Day. I graduated from Penn in 2005 and I refused to leave. So I'm just here all the time, eating the food, schmoozing, enjoying myself, hanging out with Paul, who still teaches here. Yes, old student. And yes, so I'm very fortunate. I get to be here all the time. In a minute, we're going to have you all introduce yourselves. But first, I did want to get a little bit of info about who we've got here in the audience. So how many of you here are regular podcast listeners? That makes sense, given the circumstances. How many of you have worked on podcasts? Maybe you made one, maybe you produced one, maybe you edited one. Maybe you were a guest on one. And how many of you have a great idea for a possible podcast? This guy in the back, I got to hear about that. Excellent. So in a bit, we will open things up for questions. So as we're all talking, please, listen actively because you'll have a chance to chime in a little bit, and it'll be really fun. As I think you all know, masks are optional at the Writers' House at this moment. I'm going on a family trip to Ireland in 6 days, so I refuse to get COVID at this time. Hence my mask. But know that I'm smiling under this mask. So, my friends, each of you, oh my gosh, this is so exciting. Why don't we do? So I want to try to not do the We've all been to panel discussions before where the person in my seat asks a question and it just goes 1, 2, 3, 4. We'll do that at first to introduce yourselves, but then hopefully we can break free from that. So maybe I'll have each of you introduce yourself, your name, if you want to do your pronouns, you can, what podcast or podcasts you are or have been involved with and what your roles are. And then maybe a little bit about just your trajectory, since you're all alums and many folks here are alums, your trajectory from Penn to this very moment today. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So Yowei, will you start?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name's Yowei Shaw, pronoun she and her. Let's see. So I am currently the co-host and senior producer of NPR's Invisibilia, which I used to be a producer for years before becoming a host. I actually used to help put together one of the programs at Kelly Writers' House, so it's kind of fun to be back here. I graduated in 2010. Actually, this is really interesting that Paul Hendrickson is here, my former professor, because my first audio documentary I made was from your class.
I remember that. I remember.
Yeah. And it aired on WXPN in the middle of the night when nobody was listening. So basically, I fell in love with audio before the current podcast explosion when I
I thought there wouldn't be any jobs. Like my dream at the time when I graduated was like, oh, maybe like I'll do something else for money, and like every few years I'll like maybe get to contribute a story to This American Life. If I'm lucky. I'm very grateful that things have changed. Now there are like a lot more jobs, there's a lot more opportunities, there's a lot more audience and listeners. There's a lot of really exciting things. But yeah, basically after graduating from Penn, I started like a youth radio project in Philadelphia called Philly Youth Radio. And I just started freelancing, and I was a freelancer in Philly for like 5 years. I temp produced at Fresh Air. I made some like weird audio. I just did so many different audio things before landing my producer gig at Invisibilia. So that's my little story.
I need to be on mic, I realize. Hi, I'm Naomi. I use she, her pronouns. I'm currently at Axios, where I was the founding producer of our audio team, so I've worked on all of our podcasts. We currently have one daily morning briefing, and we have a documentary show. I'm the senior producer for our documentary show, How It Happened. And I got into podcasting in like a very roundabout way. I thought I really wanted to do magazine journalism because I feel like I was on the other side of what you're talking about. Like, I thought there would still be jobs in this corner of the industry. And there are, like, actually it's not that bad. But after working for a few different magazines, kind of like trying to climb up that like editorial assistant editor track, I moved into digital journalism. After Trump was elected, I moved over to Vox.com. I thought explainers and sort of that hybrid of like super long form and then also some shorter form reactive things was really interesting. I learned a lot there. Then I went over to Axios, where I was an editor. And at that point, I had kind of switched mediums already a couple times and was thinking about how much I really loved audio. And we had just hired over a new executive editor. She's now our editor-in-chief, Sarah Gu, who had been at NPR. And she was looking for people to kind of put up their hand to volunteer to start our audio team. And I was like, okay, I think I want to do this. So I had like been a podcast obsessive since high school. I had taught myself Pro Tools like for fun. And I was like, I think I actually can do this, but no one's ever told me if I can or not. And fortunately, like Axios has been a great place that's given a lot of like coaching and mentorship. And I've been able to take sort of the skill set of an editor and move it into the audio space and direct some of our projects. So yeah, kind of a lot of like being open to different media formats, multimedia experimentation.
Awesome.
Nate. Hi, I'm Nate Chinen. My pronouns are he, him. And I think the most important fact about me is that I was the first assistant coordinator at the Writers' House before it was known as the Kelly Writers' House. So this is very much a homecoming for me. I graduated in 1998 and went into a career in music criticism, which took me to a handful of different places. In 2005, I started at the New York Times. And for the purposes of this discussion, I think I'll mention that the first podcast that I was involved with was the New York Times Popcast in 2006. And to give you a sense of like what people were thinking about podcasts in 2006, the initial format of that show was all of the pop critics reading their record reviews. So I would just read what I had written, send it in, and that was the show.
Yeah.
And obviously, very compelling audio experience there. And I actually did not, so, I'm a print journalist. 5 years ago, I moved into public radio. So I now contribute to NPR Music, and I'm, often on the All Songs Considered podcast. But I had never gotten involved in the making of a podcast until the summer of 2020, when, everyone remembers what the psyche was like in the summer of 2020. Yeah. We were all kind of like holed up and marching, and there was just a lot happening. And I had met a new DJ at WBGO where I work, and he had just moved up to Newark from Nashville, and we had gone out once and had a really nice time, and just like, wow, this guy I really like how he thinks. We had a great conversation. And so after this, months of isolation, I said, you know what, we need to do something. And it was that moment when all of the radio producers I knew were finally like being flexible enough to allow people to track in their closets or bedrooms or whatever. And so we started the podcast in a very like, let's just make it in our garage, with no real plan. And so that became the Jazz United podcast, which recently ended when Greg left WBGO, but we're working on a sequel. And I have to say, it was doing what all of you do, or trying to do it. It's been fantastic, because it was just pure like learning and experimentation, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more, but such a different form, and I've really enjoyed it.
Nice. Well, thanks. My name is Taylor Hosking. I graduated in 2017, and yeah, I also used to do Exolano here at the Writers' House. And you're in Exolano? Yeah. Oh, I'm excited to meet you. Yeah, and I started my first podcast here in the back room. The studio's still back there.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, we
with
have
Stephanie, who's here.
We have a recording studio, so after this, we can all go back there and record podcasts.
Yeah, it was the second podcast to ever be a part of the DP, and the first like culture podcast to be a part of the DP, called In the Cut. Just trying to represent for all the people who didn't really feel so a part of like the mainstream culture of Penn, and like chat with cool creatives around campus. And yeah, so then I came into the media industry also through like digital media, writing articles and stuff. Did like the Atlantic Fellowship program back when I thought I was mostly interested in political journalism and like covering protest movements, which like I was as like an urban studies major, but I was also, supposed to be covering Trump, and then being like, hey, audio team, can we I want to be invited to your meetings. Can you tell me how to, teach me how to do these things in your free time? And just kind of leveraging relationships and to learn more. And then did more culture staff writing at Vice for a while, but then just kind of being a part of the daily churn of articles, I was just like, there's a whole world where people get to have way more time to work on their stories, and like get to work in teams on things, and get to just like belabor things almost too much at times, but like, yeah, so I just circled back to my interest in podcasting, which landed me at a number of different places, but primarily Pineapple Street Media, which is like a very new age podcast company that ended up landing a lot of really great partnerships. And so came up as an AP to producer there, and then was able to like pitch original show ideas. And I mean, another one of those things where it's like, you're supposed to be an AP on the show. And I was like, yeah, but I'm just going to develop my own show ideas. And so then Insecure on HBO ended up buying like my first podcast idea last year. Yeah. Yeah, which was all about their music culture, or that show's soundtrack and the way that it impacted music culture over the past 5 years. And so, yeah, I've kind of landed in this music culture journalism lane as both a writer and producer. And I'm currently working on a podcast with WHYY here in Philly.
Hey.
About the evolution of Pride, and how there's like a conflict going on right now among Pride organizers, where like the mainstream Pride organizations have like disbanded in a few cities because they weren't like representing the community well, I guess, supposedly. And now there's like a new group of organizers trying to build things from the ground up. So it's like a reality TV type podcast that's happening right now. And that's me. Yeah.
That's you. I guess I should say very briefly, I have also been involved in a podcast, actually one that we've recorded right here in the recording studio at the Writers' House, which is why I was asked to sit in this chair today. So my podcast is called Dead Parents Society. Thank you. And it actually originated via conversations that happened here at the Writers' House over a number of years. So when I was in pre-Penn, so when I was 12, my mom died. And I've written a good deal about that over the years. And then being a student who then became a grown-up here at the Writers' House, I've formed relationships with many students, but, you know, if I may, maybe my favorite group of students is fellow members of the Dead Parents Society. And there was one time a bunch of years ago where we were talking in the kitchen, because that's where all the most important conversations happen here. And a couple of us who had dealt with that and who had written about it said, we should do some kind of collab where we talk about the fact of writing about this kind of loss. And then in 2018, I was given the opportunity to start some kind of project here of my own devices. And I thought, maybe now is the time to do that thing that we talked about. And so the podcast Dead Parents Society is, typically our form is we feature one writer who has written about the death of a parent, typically at a young age. I don't know. As I get older, I define young age differently. Am I the only one who does that? But so often somebody who maybe lost a parent as a child, or even in college, or even in their 20s, right? And we've had a few sneak in who experienced that at slightly older ages as well. And so we talk about the writing, but of course we also are talking about the experiences that we've faced, and to kind of transition that into maybe our first topic. I'm wondering for each of you about just by way of introducing yourselves, most of you mentioned in one way or another the concept of collaboration. And I think podcasts, that's one of my favorite things about podcasts, is how collaborative they are. How one thing I'll keep coming back to is how intimate and familiar a podcast is, especially when you have your earbuds or you're driving and you're just, I often feel like listening to a podcast is like hanging out with my friends, right? I think I'm friends with everyone who hosts a podcast I listen to, because I'm just used to their way of speaking and everything. But I'm wondering if you all can maybe say a little bit, and I'm thinking specifically about Taylor and Naomi, who are behind the scenes. If you want to speak a little bit just about the nature of collaboration, how your teams work, maybe if you've been on different podcasting teams, how those have worked for you over the years, months, weeks, days.
Sure, yeah. I feel like the more bare bones structure of a team that I've been a part of is the producer is, helping figure out the guests and plan the questions and plan the episodes and all of that, and also edit afterwards. And then there's just a host who's hopefully helping, and a engineer that kind of looks at everything at the end to make sure all the sound levels and everything is a-okay. But then I've also been on large teams where there's an associate producer, maybe multiple producer level people, maybe a managing producer to coordinate everybody, plus an engineer, and maybe even a talent booker as well. And so those mammoth productions exist as well.
Yeah, I think what's interesting to me about collaboration is in the development process. So certainly developing new show concepts, but the documentary show I work on right now, we pick a totally different topic every season. We're on our 4th season now, which is about the war in Ukraine. And so every season has sort of required collaborating with a different reporter who becomes the host of that season, their editors, their team, anybody else who works with them. And it sort of requires rebuilding the show's identity a little bit every semester so that they're the right person to be the voice and face of it, which is a really fun process. It's kind of like being in the movie being John Malkovich. I feel like I get paid to crawl into the back of people's heads and try to figure out the best thing they should do and say. And I'm kind of joking about that, but obviously I have everyone's best interests at heart. But it does really feel like this deeply, deeply empathetic act where you're very much working with somebody to adapt an incredibly specific skill set that they already have, like the sources they have, the way they work those relationships, the way they do their reporting, the way they present it, like how much analysis they're comfortable doing, how much they just want to do straight reporting, how much they want to do character development. And then you're like working with them to adapt all of those things into this space they may not be super comfortable with, that can be like incredibly self-conscious and cringy to like hear yourself record it. Like it can be really hard. And I think working with people when they feel like vulnerable but excited and challenged is so exhilarating. And so yeah, a lot of my job is like getting to hear people's hopes and dreams, and then as the senior producer, then going like, okay, what resources do we have to make this happen, and how will this dovetail with like other people on the team's hopes and dreams? Is there somebody who, you know, would love to ride passenger seat to this person on this reporting assignment? Like, how can we make these things happen? So yeah, collaboration's like the best part. I could talk about it for hours.
Well, and you're like, I love what you're saying, Naomi. You're like the woman behind the curtain, and also the hype woman, and also the like, you know, rule maker in a way. But that's so cool. And you have to make it look seamless in a way.
Yeah, it's like I do all the sweating, so no one else will do any sweating. But it's, yeah, I mean, it's really nice, actually. I will say this, like, I think for anybody listening who's like thinking about going into journalism, I think there's like an incredible amount of autonomy and agency that happens when you're an editor or a producer, because you're like creating the structure of the thing and also creating the thing. And I think actually it can be a balm, especially when you're covering things that can give you a lot of like anxiety and stress, to be part of crafting the structure, part of determining the deadlines, part of like assessing what the resources are and how best to delegate for people's strengths. Like, I actually find that is an incredibly like soothing, wonderful process, especially because I ask people in advance like how they want me to do it, so people usually don't get too upset.
That's amazing. And Nate and Yowei, you've been sort of on both sides of it. You've been hosts, but you're also both on the editorial side. You don't just show up as a host and say like, "Where's my script? Get me the sparkling water." But could you speak to what the collab looks like from your ends?
I'll defer to you. Yeah.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Well, so I'm in this interesting position where I'm now a host of a show when I never thought, I never really wished to be a host or thought I had what it takes to be a host. And so like one of the main, I think like early on, I learned this trick when I was freelancing, and I had very little experience. I was pitching to shows, and I realized that like if they said yes to your story and they had enough resources to assign you an editor and a producer, that through that collaborative process, like magic would happen and they would make the story sound good. Like, I would not have been able to do that on my own, especially back then when I had so little experience. And so I think that's like I only work in like documentary long form, so like I'm gonna stay in my lane talking about that. But like every story that you listen to has been like iterated, picked apart, what Taylor was saying, like belabored, just like polished like a gem, you know, over and over. And it's really a collaborative group effort, whatever you hear, even if you are only hearing a host or reporter's voice. And I'm really glad that right now we're finally starting to not always invisibilize that labor of producers and editors and behind the scenes folks. I think that's like a really bad norm that somehow was around. And I'm actually most interested in like trebling that norm on air too, on mic. I think that is like, we're seeing that more and more, and I think it's really interesting. But yeah, so like, I think my main challenge as like a host now in the collaborative space is to let myself be produced and not be a producer of the thing, because like I just go into automatic producer mode all the time, and that's like I need to stay in my lane, you know, and like allow other folks to really like shine in their roles and like help me like help the thing. And I think that's like one of the things about collaboration in like these teams where everyone is sort of doing a lot of things. Everyone's editing, everyone's reporting, everyone's doing all of the things. and yet we also have different strengths and we have different roles, and sort of like just like that dance of like how to like be flexible but also respect each other's autonomy and strengths. That's something that, you know, we still, you know, we're still working through.
And it's very writerly, you know, it's like sitting around a workshop table or something, you know, and realizing, to use a phrase, practicing the art of non-defensive listening, right?
Oh my gosh.
And where you're allowing yourself to be produced. And I think anybody who's submitted writing, you know, and had it published somewhere, even if it's like they changed my comma to a semicolon, and, you know, we're always attached to the comma.
Well, yeah, like one more thing about like the I feel like that is the number one, like if you can develop that superpower of just like not being defensive about letting other people help you. Like, I feel like, I don't know, like I have a kink for edits. Like, I just like, give me edits, help me. Like, I have tried my best to solve this story problem. Like, I need your edits. That's like the greatest, I don't know, gift and like act of love that I feel like team members can give each other.
Oh.
Well, one thing popped into my head that I think is worth pointing out, which is this sort of taxonomy of podcasts. You know, I'm just such in awe at the sort of long form narrative podcast model, and all of you have worked in that. My experience in podcasts is much more rooted in the kind of like topic of the week, like experts jumping on and just bantering. So the last time I was in this room was a few weeks ago when Dana Stevens was here to talk about her Buster Keaton biography, and it's a trip to have a conversation IRL with Dana Stevens, because you've got this voice
that
that
voice.
you just,
I know that voice.
You've lived with for years.
Yeah.
You know, so that's the kind of, that's where more of my experience in podcasts has been, is just sort of, you know, a relationship between the hosts that is kind of the main draw. Like, that's what I wanted to create with Jazz United, was we want to develop this thing where people are just really interested to like sit at the table with us, and so the topic, you know, obviously the topic matters and the topic is often the hook, but really the draw of the show was like this banter and this relationship. And so consequently, the show got better and better because we got to know each other, you know. And remember, the whole show was pandemic era, so Greg is one of my very good friends now, and our friendship really developed over the course of making this show. And now we actually do hang out in real life, but for the first year and a half, we would see each other on the Zoom when we were recording the show. So the collaboration, it's a very small team. It's Greg and me and a producer, and we, you know, we would develop the idea just in phone calls and emails, and gradually figured out, well, this is the kind of conversation that really sparks between us. And so often it was like a sort of familiar signpost in jazz culture that we had kind of a slightly skewed take on. So when the Kenny G documentary came out, as a music critic, I was really fascinated by it and interested in talking about, you know, how Kenny G fits in. And Greg, who is a musician as well as a broadcaster, he was just like, you know, he came out flaming like this guy needs to go away. You know? And so that made for a really fun dynamic, because I'm kind of like, well, you know, let's think about, and he's like, no, this guy is just bad. Like, we need to get rid of him. So just that kind of dynamic, it was really fun to you know, work on that. And I will echo what you said about the feedback. As someone who's done a lot of editing, like, I love when someone can hear, you know, because you just can't hear it clearly yourself, especially when you've been really, I imagine, working on these like long form shows. You're on like episode 4 of like a 9-episode arc, and so that someone who knows how to listen for the seams or the story vulnerabilities, like, that's gold, you know. And in my experience, the people I know who work in podcasts, not only are they not defensive, they're like actively yearning for productive, like constructive criticism. Like, please, you know. So I think it is a really collaborative.
Well,
space.
and to comment specifically on, I listened to that episode you were just talking about with about Kenny G, and I am not a jazz person except for my tenure in high school jazz band, tenor saxophone. But
It counts.
yeah, sure. But you know, for me listening to that podcast, I was initially like, okay, like this is like not my lane. This is not my area. But over the course of the hour or so, it kind of felt like, oh, they're going to like spill some tea about what real jazz people think about Kenny G. And it felt, and you know, there were moments, if I may, that were there was like some talking shit a little bit about Kenny G, which like talking shit is my love language. So I was like all in. And by the end of the podcast, I felt like I was the person, like if we were all having a drink together, I was the one like finishing the bottle of wine being like, I can't believe, you know, like I had bought in so much. But with regard to that, I'm wondering, Nate, like how much, you know, and you sort of alluded to this a minute ago, how much of that conversation, because your podcast is a conversational podcast as opposed to a narrative podcast where you're reading, you know, you have a script, for instance, for yours, and I feel like, and yours are all scripted, you know, for the most part. But I'm wondering, Nate, about what does the prep look like, and how much of it is kind of freewheeling or surprising each other, or you know, going in a direction you didn't necessarily anticipate.
Yeah, it was very experimental and organic how we sort of landed on it. And I've been interviewing people for 25 years, and I never go into an interview with notes, ever.
Really? No notes.
No notes.
Did you write the notes beforehand and then you put them aside?
I sometimes will take notes and then just to organize my thoughts.
Wow.
But I found that, and this proved true on the show too, because for a while I would put together a kind of loose outline in Google Docs and we'd look at it, and I realized like what happens, at least for us, is that when you've got that, it kind of it would create this sort of speed bump in the conversation where you could sense like, okay, it's going in this interesting place, but like, well, let's kind of bring it back to the thing.
Right.
You know?
I have this next bullet point.
Yeah, and so you end up losing something. You gain a sort of focus there, but you also lose kind of the thing that we all enjoy about conversation, right?
Yeah.
And it's very specific to this kind of show. You know, and when you listen to it's been interesting, you know, building a show from scratch, and then, you know, the shows that I listen to regularly that are this format, you know, are things like the Slate Political Gabfest, the Slate Culture Gabfest, some stuff on The Ringer, and then you begin to hear it and realize, okay, well, there's like a lot of preparation here, but if you can hear the preparation, then something's wrong, right? Like if you and I feel like, even on those shows sometimes I'm like, oh, I wish they didn't say, okay, now's the time when we do this. It's like,
that's a Slate thing.
It's a Slate thing.
We love Slate though.
Yeah, I mean, I love it, but I also was like, you know, it doesn't have to be so like. It reminds me of like watching like shows on ESPN, like, you know, pardon the interruption, where you're like, here's this topic,
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, I feel like that's also something that needs to change more now, because a lot of folks, especially younger APs, are taught to just like research the hell out of this person and only put questions on this sheet that you already know the answer to, like that you already know that they have a story to speak to here, which also means that like they've already told that story.
Yeah.
And so it's just also one of those classic kind of indoctrinated, I guess, like ways of going about producing interviews that feels really backwards nowadays. Yeah.
Which almost reminds me of like, you know, with the late night shows. I mean, I was a huge fan of David Letterman when I was growing up, but like the classic format of that is like you have a celebrity come on and tell their 8-minute quirky anecdote that is completely pre-planned, you know, and that was like the mode for so long, but it's kind of a stupid mode.
Yeah. Well, it makes me, so I'm really glad you asked Nate this question because I was going to ask you that question too. Because at our show, we are trying to bring more conversational banter and spontaneity and just like, you know, what you love about like the weird sparks and like weird things that you can discover on the fly into these like highly produced, highly reported, very belabored in like complicated stories, narrative stories. And so we've been experimenting for a while. We have tried this technique, but I would love to hear like other people's techniques and if you have thoughts about ours. Basically, so I'm a planner. Like I really need a plan and I get anxious and not able to like perform on mic if I don't have a plan. So like what you do would like make me go crazy and I would not be able to do it. So the way we do this with my co-host, who's much more on the lines of like, I don't want notes. I need to go. Like, so we have like a tailored approach. So we call it a conversational tell. And so there's going to be a teller and then there's going to be a receiver. And it could be a reporter, producer, host, whoever. You just have a teller and a receiver. The teller basically writes a script the normal way that you would write a script. You cut tape, you put it together, you have a thing, you have it edited so that it's like in good enough shape, the thing makes sense. And we very carefully hide that information from the receiver so that there is genuine reaction when we get in the studio. So then we also do this thing where we give the receiver kind of like a map where they don't have the script, but they have almost like stage directions almost of like, be listening very intently. Here's like a part where like, then there's going to be a shift and like now we're going to like maybe think about if you have any anecdotes about X, but like they don't really know what's happening, but they have like a little bit of preparation because we're trying to do this in an efficient amount of time, right? Like, you know, you could do it totally on the fly. We want to, and so yeah, that's how we do. And then we have a producer who's like directing us, and then we cut it together.
I was going to say, and the magic of editing streamlines it all.
Yes.
Yeah, I feel like I've done a kind of similar thing where I was working on this more narrative piece for New Yorker Radio Hour about these like rappers in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the story originally was like a completely written out script that I just like read and tried to bring life to, or have you. And then in this version, I basically just told him the story, and then he would just kind of think about ways that I could maybe do certain tells better, give a few more directions, and then ask me to just like on the fly, no notes, like retell that with those few tips. And then also just tell me to like lighten up, stop being so serious, be more fun, like, or whatever. And so then that would just kind of happen more organically and like kind of coax personality into the serious story. Yeah. And then we had a reactor.
Yeah, another podcast that does what you're describing that I've enjoyed is called Maintenance Phase. It's Aubrey Gordon and Michael Hobbs, I think. Yeah. And it's about sort of body image debunking and diet culture debunking, and they switch off. So sometimes it's Aubrey like who does all the research and she's telling Michael and he reacts, and they just have such great reactions to each other. And that whole dynamic again adds to this. As a listener, you're like, you feel like you're sort of leaning in over, you know, having a coffee or having a drink with them, and you're just like, you're also feeling that reaction in the moment, you know.
Yeah. I just think that, like, just to zoom out a bit, I feel like it's really interesting that all of us taught ourselves a lot of what we're now doing professionally, and also that it's just interesting to hear everybody's like own techniques. It just feels like what I love about this medium is that it's like a baby medium. Like it is truly a baby. It is in its infancy state, or maybe it's like a toddler now, maybe not an infant. And it's like, it's an art medium that we're all figuring it out. We're all like, you know, like, yes, there were these kind of conventions about what a good story is, how you're supposed to produce a two-way, blah, 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 blah. And then it's like, oh, wait, this is a baby medium, and like there are obviously other ways to do it and do it in an interesting way. And I think that's like the work that is most exciting to me when I hear stuff now, is just like the stuff that is troubling and just like making new discoveries about what this medium can do.
Yeah, I think it's amazing and awesome that, like Taylor, that you were making a podcast at the writer's house. You know, that blows my mind, and it's obviously like that should be happening, and I think it's really, really cool that there is a path that, you know, like an undergraduate right now could be looking at and say like, oh, look, I'm interested in this kind of podcast trajectory. Like, it's not just getting into podcasts, but it's literally like there are several different, you know, forms that you could gravitate towards. It's really cool.
Yeah, I just want to add, I think this point about like teaching ourselves what to do is really interesting. I mean, I also want to give the same shout out to Paul Hendrickson, because I think most documentary work actually translates really well. But but it's funny, like I think I'm working at a company that's trying to like reinvent a lot of different storytelling mechanisms at once. So like we were trying to like figure out a different way to do newsletters. We were trying to figure out like a different way to do short form journalism that's like very direct. We were trying to figure out new ways to build trust with an audience in a moment when trust in media is really low. And so we had been targeting over and over again. I don't think I'm like sharing any secrets. It's pretty obvious what Axios does. Like, you know, our newsletters come from specific reporters' names who are like the person helping it that day. You know, our podcast, obviously podcasting is such an intimate medium. Like, you're literally oftentimes putting something into your body to receive it. And like, to your point, you feel like you know these people really well. And I think like there is a reality that, you know, it's so interesting, Nate, what you said about having to bond with your co-host over Zoom. Like, you can't really fake it. Like, it actually just has to feel authentic. The surprise has to feel authentic. The reaction has to feel authentic.
Because you can hear it.
Yeah,
Totally. You can hear the podcasts where
The corniest podcast in the world.
Yes, where the banter is scripted, and you're like, oh no, come on.
Yeah.
Like, you had time to think of that joke, and that was the joke.
Right. And you have editors who could have edited it out and left it in.
Right. But yeah, anyway, it's an experimental space, which I think like lends actually a lot of authentic feeling of like freedom, experimentation, messing around, trying something new. That's just, I think it's like really exciting, but I think that's part of why we crave like so much like unexpected joy, wonder, reaction from the medium, because it sort of infuses, I think, like every piece of it in some ways, like from making it to listening to it.
Well, and Naomi, I was thinking about this idea of like the familiarity and intimacy, and often that comes as we're discussing through, you know, the group conversation on a podcast, or the back and forth, or the telling and listening. But then, you know, one of the episodes that you produced that I was listening to was the Jonathan Swan talking about, you know, all the Trump stuff. And, you know, that's just one guy on a podcast. So you might think that you would lose that, but it's scripted, you know, he's right, or
it's actually
is it not?
Oh, amazing. I know, that's why it sounds good. I know, like, here's the secret sauce.
But how does he do that? But it's
I
like,
can tell you.
Well, you're like the puppet master, so
I mean, to answer it, I think so Jonathan Swan is like an incredible interviewer, an incredible storyteller. Like, Jonathan, if you're listening, just kidding. You're definitely busy with your child today. But you know, when you're working with somebody who's like so good at what they do, you already have so much to work with. But with Jonathan, what's like great about him is he takes direction really well. He's also somebody who's like, give me more edits. And so you can ask him, like, there's this great scene in the first season of How It Happened where they're on Air Force One, and he knew every single detail of that scene. He was able to do incredible reporting. And he knew what everybody had eaten. And Lindsey Graham had strawberries and cream, which he always orders on Air Force One, apparently, every time he flies it. As one does. As one has their personal order. And
I'm a peaches and cream on Air Force One, but I understand.
Right. I think the meal was like quinoa salad and chicken, because I listened to this tape like 7,000 times. But in the studio, we were like, you know, we were able to be like, retell the scene this way. Like, can you like start by describing the food? Can you start by describing where people are sitting? And you can like do it a few different ways, and the person knows their material well enough to riff. And like, I mean, when I think back to that season, it felt like sitting around a campfire and everybody trying to tell almost like ghost stories, because you were just like, you knew that what you were talking about was like so riveting, and that really the decisions to make were like when to give which piece of information in what order. And so there was a lot of,
So
pacing.
Scarier than any ghost story.
Yes. But the pacing of it, right? Like, when should we get? And I was thinking with that one too, because those episodes are pretty short, right?
Very short.
Yeah, like 20 minutes.
Yeah, we do long form and short forms.
Yeah. But I was thinking about how you all must have decided on what beat to end each episode. And there's, even though most of us remember what happened between, the 2020 election or leading up to the 2020 election and to the January 6th stuff, we were there, like we were paying attention, but I was like listening, like, I gotta hear the next one. And, you created this kind of suspense and tension, and Jonathan does, partly in the tone of his voice, and also he uses, he's using the first person, like he refers to himself, not throughout, but on certain occasions. Mm-hmm. So then it was like, oh, he's telling us what he had never reported before. So now I'm getting, speaking of spilling tea, right? Like I'm getting this info, this inside info. So me and this guy are just like, sitting here having I'm on the other end of this conversation, which, feeds into it all.
Yeah, I also just have to give a shout out to Amy Padula, who was like the genius architect of that storytelling format in that season. I'm like a big give everybody credit person.
And some of it too, even for really seasoned journalists who are involved in podcasting, sometimes even great journalists and great writers can kind of take some things for granted, such as knowing what everybody eats on Air Force One, or even just getting the comments and the sources that you can get. Another podcast I've been enjoying lately is called Icons Club. It's on The Ringer. It's Jackie McMullen, who's a well-known sports writer originally from Boston. And Jackie McMullen's, she's in the Basketball Hall of Fame as a sports writer. She can literally pick up the phone and get Michael Jordan to do an interview. Not a lot of people can. So she has like Michael Jordan commenting on whatever she wants, and that's not something, I could do all the sports bro podcasts I want to my heart's content, and guess who's not going to return my calls, So that's just like another thing, especially in the podcast form too, which might, a Michael Jordan might not necessarily be like, sure, I'll help you with your podcast, but he'll help Jackie McMullen with her podcast, so that's a cool thing. Speaking of this baby medium, I'm thinking about the concept of like leveraging the form, which it sounds like, I know you all have. And maybe, what do we have to say about maybe on the pre-production development and, what stories have you all wanted to tell through podcasts that you wouldn't have told in another form, like through traditional writing or through, say, even like radio itself. But how have you leveraged the form that way?
Well, I guess I can talk about the Insecure podcast a little bit.
That was the first one I thought of, actually. Yeah.
So basically the idea there was like, okay, a lot of music podcasts are not able to like play very much of the songs that they're talking about because of different rules. And if you just kind of like make short snippets of content about the song and then just put it on Spotify in a playlist format, then you can obviously just like put songs between the tracks there. So it was kind of a simple fix in a way, but then also that got us thinking about, okay, well, album interludes are really big right now between like Jasmine Sullivan Hotels, Kendrick Lamar stuff, like, Blood Orange, Negro Swan, like things like that, that are getting built out more and more into these like interesting stories between artists' songs. So we were like, let's also kind of play into this moment in the zeitgeist where people want to hear kind of extended interludes for albums. So we were like, all right, well, maybe this project can be essentially like an album with extended podcaster-led like story interludes between the songs, and then also, of course, like infuse your culture criticism in there. So yeah, that was kind of how that idea spiraled and developed from just like listening to these album interludes and like imagining a different type of form, and then kind of thinking about what tools are out there to make that happen. And yeah, so I was just like really happy that we were able to do that in general, and also to be able to have a sound designer like really get in there and like build out these different scenes where you can have like a quiet storm interlude and like set this whole like bathing in a bathtub scenario, like while you're having somebody hot from the show like tell you about you know, what's up next or whatever. And so we were also able to come up with these kind of like little dreamscapes that are associated with the world of the show before diving into whatever stories we actually wanted to tell. So yeah, I love that about audio, that you can kind of like have people imagine their own like worlds and have a lot of room to be able to like play around and set different like moods before you really get into whatever you're here to talk about or whatever.
It's so cool. And would you say that the music licensing challenge actually was the impediment that like nudged you towards this like format?
Yeah, definitely. Just wondering why we can't have more music in the podcast.
Yeah, so like the constraint became an opportunity, and also about that podcast, Insecure Interludes podcast. Speaking of short, I mean those might be the shortest podcasts I've heard. They're like 5 minutes, you know.
Yeah, so and then having to focus on figuring out how to get somebody to tell a story that feels complete within 5 minutes, and also talking to rappers who will only have 20 minutes or whatever. So those became the challenges there, but yeah, I was happy with how.
And that was a podcast you pitched, is that right?
Yeah, and it kind of like came from some reporting that I had been doing at Vice, like trying to write about the soundtrack there. So I kind of already knew a few stories that we could try to get when we pitched it to HBO, and Pineapple already creates shows with them usually for like recapping episodes of TV, like attached to certain shows. And so also there was an opportunity to try to make them do something more experimental. And then the fact that they liked it meant that we could kind of do more of that in the future. So.
And pitching to HBO, pitching to the network that produces the show in question solves a how do we get the people
yeah, because in music journalism in particular, like their PR emails are not online anywhere, and whereas like TV and film people, all their contacts are online. But
well, if HBO gets behind it, Issa Rae kind of has to participate, or you know,
her like record label did the booking of the artist for us.
So that solves a lot of like behind the scenes logistical nightmare questions.
I feel like podcasting is definitely evolving to a space where oftentimes shows are a collaboration among like many different companies that all have different strengths, and just kind of like figuring out the logistics ahead of time when you're pitching has become a thing.
Other leveraging the form moments, thoughts?
Well, I can say that Trevor Smith, who was our producer on Jazz United at BGO, he is now the producer on a show that's in the piloting process, but we're excited about it. And I think it is a perfect example of something that has found its ideal medium. So the show is called Jazz Cabbage, and it was pitched by Nicole Sweeney, who's an on-air announcer at BGO, and David Bienenstock, who is a cannabis historian. And this is a story about jazz and cannabis, and it goes back to the origins of the art form. It ends up being a story about culture and politics and obviously race, and so it's this very like multi-dimensional, rich. It's going to be sound designed, and in this early process already, they've interviewed Tommy Chong, and this is I'm very excited about this. There is tape that exists at the Louis Armstrong House Museum that has never been released before, and it's Pops talking about his love of marijuana. Just it was a very important part of his life, and but was not, for obvious reasons, was not often out in public. Everybody knew,
Sure.
but so there's tape that will be used in the show of Louis Armstrong, a home recording, of Louis talking about his love of reefer. So that's we could write that as a magazine story, about that history, and I'm sure that would be
Right,
fine.
and quote,
but there's just so much possibility in the format, so we're excited about it.
Yeah. Leveraging audio archives towards podcasting. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense.
I was just going to say, I think in some interesting ways, like the pandemic allowed people, I hate saying it this way, to lower the standards they have for what audio sounds like, because people got really accustomed to hearing Zoom. I think it pushed a lot of producers to really think about like the level at which microphones in like iPhones and Androids actually are like pretty high quality and pretty functional, pretty reliable. And then if you could get somebody into like a carpeted soft surfaces room with an iPhone, you could like probably get some pretty good quality tape that you could definitely like massage into something that sounds like professional quality. And for much of the pandemic, I was the lead producer on a daily afternoon interview format show that was like 15 minutes or less. And the thing that was great about it is like really high profile people were able to make a few minutes in their day. Yep. They knew they didn't actually have to be on camera. So they could talk to us like when they were working from home, from their home office. They could like step into their bedroom or into the closet to give us that like padding we needed. But it just became so much easier to ask people for like, I mean, we were already asking for a very small amount of time, but especially because people were like, it sounds so bad to say it this way, but it's like because we were all working from home and there were no boundaries.
Yeah.
It also meant that people, were like, oh, I'm not like dressed in my suit for a TV appearance, but I'm still okay to make comment. Like I'm right. in a space that's not echoey, hard conference rooms. I can like do this for you all. Right. And we got some like really amazing interviews out of just being able to be incredibly elastic about that, like including Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer, joined us on the day of their efficacy data coming out because the ask was so low that people were willing to say yes. I mean, like we had Ron Klain, we had Anthony Fauci, we had like some incredible people who I think if I'd been asking them for like a few years ago, like formal, like can you go to a studio, like all these things, we might record it on video because we may put it on YouTube, like. Yep. They wouldn't have had time for that in that environment.
Right. And also at this point, like none of us would be fazed to be listening to something and hear a dog bark or a baby cry or whatever in the background. Or remember pre-pandemic, this was a TV thing, a video thing. There was that one news clip that went viral of the man and his little toddler came in and the mom, like it was, hilarious. But that's like, that no, we wouldn't even care now, if like that happened to everybody 100 times, like my dog is more famous on Zoom than I am, like because I like here he is, everybody. But yeah, so that's a really great point too about the last couple years.
I've been listening to all of you all speak about how you're leveraging the medium with your respective podcasts, and the thing that I've been thinking about, like I don't feel like I'm able to answer that question actually because I have not worked in any other medium, so I really don't know. I don't actually know how I would like write a piece. But I've been thinking about actually how our show, I feel like our particular mission of our show, which is the tagline is to examine the invisible forces that shape our everyday life. So it's basically like pairing really emotionally intimate documentary storytelling with ideas, like trying to surface dynamics, narratives, other things that are propelling the action in that story. So we're often making an argument in our story. We're like an ideas/documentary show, which I think like there aren't actually, there are some, but it's not like the norm, because I think ideas are really, I don't think it's actually well suited for our medium to go really in depth in ideas in the way that you could in a print piece, in a New Yorker piece, in an Atlantic article,
Or in a book.
Or in a book,
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. It's like we really, so we do all of this background reporting. We talk to all of these researchers, scientists. We do so much, and then we have to really just like, we're like, it's generally just like, there's 3 ideas that we can like actually explore in a given episode, because we're also trying to do the narrative thing. And so we often think about on our show, like how, like we're trying to use all of the tricks in the book that our medium has to offer to like make you feel those ideas and to make you really engage with them in a medium that I don't think really like encourages that. And so I'm thinking about this recent episode that our fabulous producer and reporter Abby Wendell did recently. It was called The Great Narrative Escape, and it was basically the story came out of this challenge that we had together. So like, I'm somebody on our show that loves to pitch kind of traditional narrative stories, like this happened, and oh shit, this other crazy thing happened. Kind of like, that's like a traditional kind of narrative thing with in our form. But Abby is always pitching she's not attracted to those kinds of stories. She's pitching stories that are driven more by questions or by a feeling, or it's just not like this happened, and then this happened. Which is kind of like a doctrine in like documentary audio storytelling, I would say. And so a lot of times her pitches wouldn't go through, you know? And then basically I threw down a gauntlet to her. I was like, okay, so like, can you tell a boring story, narrative story on a podcast and make me want to listen to the end? Because I have very like little attention span. So like, I'm always just like, I need the narrative hooks to like drag me to the end. Like I'm always like out in a, like it takes like the first 3 minutes, like I'm either in or I'm out. And I need all of those like little bells and whistles and narrative twists and turns to take me to the end. Anyway, so she ended up making this really weird episode that I am really, like I'm obsessed with it still. Talk about it all the time, where there's no story. There's no narrative story. It's just like a gauntlet has been thrown and Abby is just trying to tell a boring story and make it work. And so, and she does like a ton of interesting intellectual reporting about narrative and like how there's a spectrum of like narrative. There's weak narrative, there's high narrative, and like what are the perils and, you know, pros and cons of all the different kinds of narrative and what that does to our attention and da-da-da-da-da-da. And like, I feel like she like basically discovered a new thing for our show and how we make stories, where now we don't just like say yes, like it's not like a requirement anymore when you pitch your show to have like that kind of sexy narrative, because she like, I think figured out that you can tell, like there are lots of different logics that make stories work, obviously. And I feel like in our form, we've been paying attention mainly to the narrative arc. But like now we've been like on our show, we think now explicitly about the emotional arc in addition to the intellectual arc. And so like there's other ways to create like momentum and electricity in a story that don't just have to do like this happened, this happened, this happened. And so we like, because of Abby's experiment, and like I think she succeeded, she did a good job. I really like shout out to that episode. Now we map out these arcs so that we can like create those like that roller coaster feeling when you're like, because I feel like that's at the heart of what we do, is like we're creating an experience, you know, that you feel. And so like you can create that roller coaster ride according to like all these other logics that, I don't know, to me that's like really exciting and interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to, at this point, I'm going to ask you all if you have questions for each other. And in a moment, this is a heads up, my friends, I'm going to ask you all for a couple of questions for these folks. And then we will conclude, and then we will have snacks together, which is one of the best parts. But, so that's the plan, just letting everybody know. So questions for each other? Comments for each other, having listened to each other's stuff?
Yeah, I guess I'm curious now, thinking about the idea of plotting out like an action narrative arc plus like an emotional narrative arc and then an intellectual narrative arc. I imagine you might like do that independently and then like blend them afterwards? Or I use that term because that's like a TV writing term, but is that how it ended up working for you guys? Or like how do you make sure all three things happen at once at that point?
Right. So we make an outline for each one, and then I think it is mainly hanging. It's like a weird thing where I think often our story, like sometimes the narrative arc is the thing that is all the other arcs are like centered around, and we just fit them in to that arc. But sometimes it's the intellect, it's like the questions arc. So you start out with this question, which then leads you to this question, which then leads to you this question that like allows you to like create that feeling of discovery and constant exploration. And so, yeah, it's really hard and weird. Like we haven't figured it out, but I think the main thing that I feel like those arcs exist in every story for sure. It's just like, I think we're just trying to be a little bit more aware of them so that we can kind of like manipulate, like we can be in control of like how we're jerking around the listener in which ways.
I would add to that. I think a lot about formats that I know work for me across formats. And so obviously, like if I think about, like I think a lot about the writing of John McPhee, who writes a lot about structure and experimentation with structure. I think a lot about like if I love a magazine profile, is there a way to take like the DNA of a profile and make it into something that's audio? And like what does that sound like and who's telling it? Is it in the voice of the person being profiled? Is it in the voice of somebody who is close to them and spent time with them? Do you trade off? Like, but I think sometimes my goal is to create a type of storytelling experience and then work backwards to figure out like what we have, who the right voices are. But I think sometimes it's like, I think we're sort of circling the same thing. It's like sometimes you just have a gut instinct that's like, this is clearly the thing that's going to guide us through the story. And then I'm just sort of obsessed with the idea of adaptation and experimentation and like blending across mediums. And so like the thing I come back to more than literally anything else is Dante's Inferno, where like Virgil's taking Dante through hell and he's like, remember those celebrities from like Aeneid? They're burning in hell forever. Like, and then he's like, but don't look at those suckers too long. Let's like move along and look at these poor fools. And like, I think a lot about how like you just have to have momentum and you need like a combination of somebody who's really curious and somebody you really trust. Sometimes that's the same person. But like if you have those three elements, like a great thing you're moving through, and like incredible curiosity that holds space for the listener's curiosity, like incredible expertise that makes it feel like satisfying when you're done listening. I think you already like have the elements in a lot of ways. And then to your point, like you're sort of picking like when you put out the like which breadcrumb where.
I did not have a reference to Dante's Inferno on my bingo card for today's program, so that's cool.
4 semesters of Italian at Penn.
Well, I was thinking back also, Taylor, to what you were saying about, for the Interludes podcast and how you create these dreamscapes and these moods. It's very vibey, that podcast. I love it. But I also think about, I don't know, like, do you all create, I'm curious what your rituals are for when you start a project. Like, do you have a mood board? This is something that like an editor told me like a year ago, and now I'm like, oh, now I always want a mood board for every story, because like playlist, colors, like inspiration reference, like what you were talking about, Naomi, with like stealing from other art forms, like this TV show open, like that kind of thing. What are your rituals?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely had a playlist that we created from this top that was just like songs that we all love from the Insecure soundtrack, or that we just think is the vibe and the energy that we want to, that will get us excited about doing this project at all, that we can just kind of always be listening to through the months that we're creating it. And I also think that initial pitch deck became a mood board of its own, because there were a lot of visuals in there as well. And I also think I've worked with producers who will constantly kind of bring up movies that they feel like are kind of like cousins to the way that this story is unfolding. And like sometimes it'll be very out of left field. Like the Tulsa hip hop piece was like, the producer kept talking about Finding Nemo, kept talking about The Lion King. Like, this
Speaking
is our
of
this
what's on
montage
the
right
bingo
here
card,
is, like,
yeah.
a Wimbo when they're like walking on the logs, and then he becomes older, and then or whatever, and then it really does clarify like how you're building the emotions and the stakes, and like how that montage needs to move, and we can't belabor, and like. Yeah, and also the pacing of the story becomes a lot clearer when people start talking about wild movie metaphors. Yeah.
Yeah. Friends, do you all have questions? Everybody out there, we have a wireless mic, so our people watching us online can hear.
Class of '91 here. There was no podcast, and this wasn't here either.
Right.
Do you go into projects with any metric for audience success? Do you ask yourselves, is this idea something that would potentially resonate, or do you just do what you think you like and then see what happens?
Yeah, metrics.
Well, I think for me it depends on like what my actual goal or intention was from the outset, because for something like the Insecure project, the goal was to like get some points on the scoreboard, like sell a podcast or whatever. And so it's like, all right, let's think in terms of what makes like a lot of business sense that will also be fun to work on. And then that was really the main motivation there. But now I'm working on pitching around a show that's like an LGBTQ, like lifestyle advice, like culture podcast that is just like really important passion project to me. So it's like for that the goal is to like have it land somewhere that with like a marketing budget and a team to like give the community like the stuff that it deserves, and also to like get it to people's ears and like make sure that we don't create something really beautiful and important that nobody gets to hear because of like funding or something. And so I guess still business sense, but there the metric is also about like breadth because of what the topic is and like how important it is to me. Yeah.
Others?
Yeah, I'm not as concerned, generally speaking, about like audience numbers as I am about episode completion. So when I think about statistics that make me feel like I did a good job, that one matters a lot. I mean, also, of course, audience size does matter. And especially working on a show right now where the topic each season changes dramatically, and you can't necessarily take for granted that somebody who listened to the Trump season cares about the SpaceX season, cares about, you know, the Bibi Netanyahu season, cares about the Ukraine season. So I think we're always kind of watching like those numbers like sort of move around. But I think that like something that's really interesting to me, and I sound really like I'm drinking so much Kool-Aid today, but at Axios, we talk a lot about making a really clear why it matters and really being respectful of people's time and like not going long when we don't need to. And so that's why I come back to the episode completion rate stats, which like ours are high.
So that means, just to break that down, an episode completion
like
statistic is
it's like how far they got through the
who
episode.
listened all the way through.
Yeah. And I hope I'm allowed to say that. I think I am. But I think I know I've done a really good job making it clear why this is worth like 24 minutes of somebody's time. Because not only did they like show up to listen, but they actually finished listening, because so many podcasts, you know, you can set up your apps to like automatically download shows. And so I think for me, I'm always like, did I make a promise to them and did I keep it? And if they stayed through the end, I probably did a pretty good job keeping it.
Or they fell asleep.
Or they fell asleep.
But hey, I'm just kidding. They would never.
Yeah, that's why at the end of all of our shows, we say sweet dreams. Just, we don't do that again.
I guess the only thing I would add, I mean, I don't really think that much about it, to be honest, and I probably should. This question is making me like, I'm going to put it on my to-do list later. Yeah, I mean, for us, so much of why we greenlight a story is around like what you were saying, like, will this serve our audience? Will this help them? Is this relevant to right now? What is not? Will this add to the conversation? Which is, I think, what we're all like. Those are like everybody's kind of tent poles and criteria. But I think like for us, what I think is really important too is to think about the process and culture as well. So like we've been really like we haven't like we really want to make stuff that we are proud of, that is beautiful, that we think is helpful to our audience, and we also want to do it. We want to like do it with like a healthy culture, a work culture that we are proud of, and that we have good jobs that we are all like happy to have and fulfilled. I think that like in our, you know, in most industries, you know, creative and like all over the place, but like I feel like in our industry there's been a reckoning recently about the work culture piece, and when we privilege the product too much at the expense of like the workers, and like you know, it's just lots of people are burnt out right now and are not doing so good, and so I'm really glad we're having these conversations and trying to actually change the way we work.
Yes. Other questions? Maybe right here. Oh, he got you. Then you'll be next.
Hi, thanks everyone. So this might be a tricky question to answer because it sounds like you all kind of got your start in podcasting from a position in media, but I'm curious if you have any tips for folks who are outside of the industry on creating those opportunities to learn and practice and play with this form.
Yeah, I can jump in first. I'm like so excited to answer this question. There are definitely opportunities. There are some great audio boot camps and fellowships out there. Some of them you pay money to do. Some of them are like grants and they'll fund you doing them. So it's great to like do some, I'm sure you've done this, but like for everybody else who hasn't done it yet, do some research, Google these terms, like you'll find great programs. There are great paid fellowship programs in journalism that are a really, I think, excellent avenue for making a mid-career pivot because it funds you for like a set amount of time. It's usually a highly structured program where there's like mentorship built in, there's like work that is going to be published that you will be doing. I think any job in media or journalism is a great way into podcasting because every single job exists in podcasting. Like I was a fact checker in my first job, and like that is really helpful because first of all, like I fact check a lot of our work myself just to have redundancy, but I've also now trained a lot of people as audio fact checkers, and it's a really complicated set of quandaries to wrestle with, right? Because the way we tell stories, you're like, are you actually quoting what that person said, or are you like paraphrasing it back to me in the middle of your story? Like, do I need to call them and get a verbatim quote? Like it can get really thorny and challenging. And so I think literally any job you do in journalism will like help you be better at podcasting. I also think like just getting really good at the work itself by interviewing people in your life is like the best thing you can do. Like the first podcast I ever made, I was in high school and they were like all about my family members. But they were really meaningful. Like I called, like my mom's parents had passed away within 10 days of each other. And I was like obsessed with their love story and their like the way their lives unfolded and the way their lives also ended. And I interviewed like across the generations, like numerous members of my family who told me about them at different stages of their lives. And then I gave it out to like everybody in my family to hear. And then I got their feedback also on like what they thought about it, what stories they hadn't heard before from somebody.
Did you ask them to like and subscribe?
I was like, please subscribe to Bedroom Productions.
Please leave a review.
But I felt like, you know, they were people who were like, they cared about me, so they gave me like honest criticism, like about what had been good or not. And that was like a million years ago, feels like. But I still do think about like some of those really, really early projects I did and just how like authentically excited I was, to the point where I was like, okay, I'm not going to talk to 10 people. I'm going to talk to like 100 people if I can. And like, so just doing that and figuring out like where you're missing a voice, where you're missing a piece, like what you still want, like experimenting with music. There's so many free music libraries, so you can play around and teach yourself scoring. Like there's so much that you can do on your own, so that then if you are given a shot for like only 6 months, you're like, I'm ready. I have so many ideas. Like I want to hit the ground running. But also don't ever do unpaid labor. Don't do any unpaid labor. Like if you can avoid it. I mean, sometimes we all have to. Like I think that has happened a lot in journalism. I think it's going away. Like there's been a lot of exploitation. I think you just never have to do that. And so like make your choices for yourself. But I would say like it's like not in your best interest to devalue your labor in that way. Look for opportunities that are paid or that like give you some kind of like certification or degree if you're paying for them.
Some other thoughts. I love this question too. Transom.org. You already know about it? Okay, good. Third Coast Festival. They have the conference where they record all these talks with like really, really smart audio people giving away their secrets. And then here's another thing, which is like I feel like audio people are really nice. Like really nice. I don't know. I just feel like audio people are really nice. And like you can like reach out to like pretty much anybody and ask them questions and they'll probably talk to you. And then also community. I feel like that was like a huge part of how I came up was there was a Philadelphia listening group and like we had a potluck and we would listen to stuff and critique each other and it was so fun. But also it was like networking. Like it was like you become friends with these people and then like you hear about gigs. You can like ask people to like collaborate with you, be your editor on a thing. So like there's probably a listening group in every, I don't know about every, but like most big cities, there's some kind of community, so getting tapped into that. And then I would say, in addition to like the making stuff tip, like be okay if the stuff is not great at the beginning. Like I feel like that's because like when your standards for listening, when you're a fan, are like really high, and then there's like a big gap in the beginning, and like it's okay, just like get the reps in, and then try to get clips as soon as possible. I would say like honestly, if you're looking to get into long form, I feel like you only need like basically when people are hiring, they're only looking to see if you've done the thing, which is like for another conversation about how that's complicated and hard, that gap. But basically like if you've been able to do 1 to 3 stories for like a kind of big show reported in your voice, even if you want to be a producer, that's like your audition like tape, you know? And like I think that would really put you above other folks.
You have a question. Where's the microphone? There it is.
And first of all, thank you very much. This has been very interesting. I am not at all to the level that you guys are. And I actually had a very basic question, so apologies if it's too basic. I have an idea. What do I do with that? If I have an idea for a podcast and I'm thinking about trying it out, what do I do? Like, what are the basic steps that I should be thinking about? And thank you.
Well, I mean, you could go into kind of like ideation development mode, just kind of like write out everything. This is what I would do, I guess. Write out everything you could possibly want to do with this idea, and then kind of figure out who the players are that you would need to create something like that. Like if it's just hosted by you, do you need to go on like a quest for like a work partner to be your co-host, or like does it feel like something that you could realistically produce yourself, or does it feel like you could benefit from trying to find a producer who maybe would work like some kind of rate where you could maybe pay them in the beginning to help make a pilot or something, if they're also really into the idea, or maybe you don't have to pay them, who knows, but then you would kind of like pitch it to production houses if you wanted to go that route, or you could kind of like pitch directly to foundations if you felt like it had a maybe like public service component to it. There are so many foundations that fund shows with like humongous budgets, honestly, and so that could be one route that you could eventually be like building up toward, either on your own or with like a team of 1 or 2 folks that really believe in the idea, and then there are also some production houses. I want to say maybe Limonada is one of them, that, and maybe not Transmitter, but anyway, that primarily work with like independent host producers who are like a one-man band, and help them figure out how to like monetize and market and things like that. So there's also been like production houses that have come up to sort of like help out more independent folks, to, I guess, like professionalize what they have going. Yeah, so there are a lot of people and places that can like help once you figure out, I guess, like the level that you want to try to aim for creating the show on. Yeah.
I just learned a lot. I don't know if this is endorsed by my fellow panelists, and if it's not, you should speak out now. But last year, Glenn Weldon, who is a colleague at the NPR Culture Desk, and he's a co-host of the Pop Culture Happy Hour, he published a book called NPR's Podcast Startup Guide. And it's a very, a lot of the advice in it is extremely like detailed and like nuts and bolts, and everything from the kinds of preparation that you should do for an interview, microphone tips. Like it's there's a lot of like rich information in it, but it's really written for someone like yourself who has an idea and is like, well, where do I go with this? Like that's kind of the audience for this book. So I would encourage you to check it out. Yeah. Unless you all don't think that it's good.
I haven't read it yet, but I'm sure it's great.
It's great. It strikes me as like perfect for this situation.
And just having a book, like just something that concrete, even if you don't follow every single part of it, it can maybe teach you what you want to do differently. Sometimes you have to read that to divert from it,
Yeah.
I think also I would say another option is you could make it and find your audience, which some people do, and they get their audience. You know what I mean? It just sort of depends on like how much experience you have right now. Do you want a team? Do you want to do it by yourself? How much time do you have? What are your goals for the podcast? And also something to consider is like, should this be a podcast or should this be an episode on another show that maybe you could like use as a pilot to then like get support to get the podcast go, like just thinking also about is it limited run, do you want it to be ongoing, right. That kind of thing.
Like, could this meeting be an email?
I'll just add to this. I mean, I think from like a tech standpoint, like if you're really starting at like the very beginning, you can always get free trials of most software for like 3 months. You can play around with them. There are some great text to audio editors now available that I think are really helpful, like half steps before you get into just like only editing off of the audio itself. So like Descript is a good example, where if you're used to editing for print and you want to like get better at editing for audio, that's like a half step. Also, like the best and worst thing about podcasts is that the technology is built on RSS feeds. Like infuriating reality. And so, but that means you literally, all you need is an RSS feed, and then you're like publishing a podcast, and every podcast app and catcher like will scrape that RSS feed if they know that it exists. And so like the actual mechanics of putting it out there into the world aren't actually that technologically complicated right. once you have your audio file. There are programs like Megaphone, which is like a good platform for publishing on your RSS feed and going out to multiple platforms instantaneously. So yeah, there's like tech that makes this easier and easier every single year to do it yourself. But I think having collaborators is like probably the best place to start. Like to your point about like sort of the collaborator versus like band, one person band thing. I find that all of my ideas like seem really sharp to me, and then when I share them with other people, they get so much sharper, and vice versa. So like I think also having like even just a trusted circle of advisors where you're like, I made a draft, will you listen to it? Did I put the things in the right order? Like, do you think I missed a question I should have asked? Can be really, really helpful, especially like as you're finding your sea legs.
But that's a great point about the sort of democratic, nature of RSS feeds, for instance. You don't need to pitch to HBO or pitch to NPR or one of these, or Axios, right? So that's a great point. Maybe by way of conclusion, do you all have podcast recommendations for us? What have you been listening to? What should we be listening to?
I'll just shout out Hanif Abdurraqib is one of my favorite writers, and he wrote this, he wrote and reported and hosted this 2-part like narrative about the Fugees' album The Score, and it's called The Score Time Machine The Score, and it's split up into like side A, side B, as in like, you know, sides of a track or what have you, and it's like a personal narrative, the story of this, you know, one-hit wonder album, and also kind of this his growing up story as well. It's like a coming of age story plus a culture criticism, or like a, you know, culture journalism take on this album, and it's important. So it's really, really good. Yeah.
Others?
I'm gonna throw out a chat podcast, which is a left turn for me. Time to Say Goodbye is a really hilariously chaotically produced. The levels are all over the place. If you can get past the weird sound levels, the content is really good. It's a chat podcast with Jay Caspian Kang from the New York Times, Andy Liu, and Tammy Kim. And it's just like, it's pretty amazing how much material from the past week they're able to digest and make sense of. And they're just so smart and like funny. And yeah, it's great.
I am obsessed with normal gossip. It is incredible. It is just regular people's gossip that's been anonymized, and the host discusses it with a guest who reacts to it.
Really
Wow.
It is amazing.
It's great.
If you take some time today to listen to it, I promise your day will be brighter. And like, or you can have your money back. Like, it's so good. It will not disappoint you.
Normal gossip.
Normal gossip. Yeah.
Wow. Well, at the risk of pigeonholing myself, I'm going to talk a jazz podcast because our friends at WRTI here in Philadelphia just launched this limited series podcast called Dangerous Sounds in collaboration with the Danish Ministry of Culture. And so it's the story of jazz in Denmark over the course of a century, which it's like, okay, that's niche, right? But then it's actually a really beautifully sound designed podcast that was originally produced in Denmark and won a bunch of awards there. And the producer and writer who created it, basically the Danish archives, they archive everything, and they just opened it up. They're like, here, just have fun, So he spent like a year just doing all this research, and so it ends up being all about, there's like a lot of colonialism in there, and like just interesting stories, like the story of when the first saxophone arrived in a port in Denmark, and what so it's rich storytelling, like what happened, it's very evocative, really interesting. So
I'm going to shout out a podcast. I'm going to embarrass somebody in the room because I can. There's a podcast that Chelsea in the back has made called Love and College, and she made it in a class at Penn. And all of you are here for your various reunions, so you all romanticize college to some degree, right? Or at least you are in this moment. But it's just a great podcast. So Love and College. I'm done, Chelsea. Don't worry. Yowei.
Another recommendation. Please. Sorry. Yowei reminded me, Transom has a newsletter written by Alice Wilder called Starting Out. And if you are interested in getting into podcasting or looking for a job in podcasting, she posts all those kinds of like new opportunities, ways to get involved, boot camps that are opening up, job openings, interviews with people who give their advice if you like this kind of conversation. Also, Alice was a co-producer of mine, and she's an incredible person and another great person to reach out to for like advice. But thank you for saying Transom, because I should have shouted out that newsletter in space.
Collaborative. It's good. Yowei, Naomi, Nate, Taylor, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you so much. This was lovely. Now the best part. We have food and drink. It is out in the garden. There is DeBruno Brothers for all. Cheese, meats, vegetables, wine, beer. Please join us. Please stay. Thank you all so much.
I feel like the Writers' House always has the best food.
Yeah, totally. That's our game.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
that was
thank
so
you.
fun.